Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela Madrid, and I am the Operations Manager for the Sovereign Bodies Institute. And today we're really excited to bring you this webinar. So October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So here at SBI, we're holding a series of webinars to address this issue in different communities. So we're so excited to have Lenny and Jessica here today to talk about domestic violence within the Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ communities. So thank you, Lenny and Jessica.
Bonjour, Giriga Kuns Nindijikas. My name is Jessica Smith, and I am an enrolled member of the Boys Fort Band in Minnesota Chippewa tribe, and I am currently on Ojibwe land. I'm a survivor of human trafficking and domestic violence, a member of SBI's Survivor Leadership Council, and a research assistant with SBI.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tukan Wanagi Luta, which means Redstone Ghost. My English name is Lenny Hayes, and I am from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the northeast corner of South Dakota. I am currently owner and operator of Tate Topa Consulting. I am a mental and chemical health therapist, specializing in marriage family therapy. I am also an advocate and educator, and also I am a consultant for sovereign bodies as their missing and murdered Two-Spirit research assistant. Thank you. All right, as Jessica pulls up our PowerPoint today. So I'm really excited about being here today to discuss a topic that we typically don't talk about within our Native communities, as well as our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ communities. So what we are going to do today is that we are going to talk about the often forgotten population, domestic violence and sexual assault in the Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit community. So this is often this is like one of my favorite quotes that I have come across. And what this quote says is, every room I walk into becomes a queer space, becomes an indigenous space, becomes a two-spirit space, even if it's just me in there. So as part of our presentation, we realized that we may have individuals who may be attending this webinar today, and often a lot of people don't understand or know what the term Two-Spirit comes from. So I'm going to do a really quick overview of what Two-Spirit identity is. I know that there may be some of you who already know, but I just really believe that it's important that that we teach others about what does it mean to be Two-Spirit. So the term Two-Spirit comes from the Ojibwe language, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it. Jessica, if you'd like to, please do.
Nij Maniduwag.
Thank you. So what it means is that when we say an individual identifies as Two-Spirit, so what that means is that that individual has both a masculine and feminine spirit. So for me, one of the things that I always say about myself, I do identify as a Two-Spirit male, but I also identify as a Winkta, which was the word that was given to me by my people. But one of the things that I say that signifies for myself, and I feel very comfortable with it, is that I will often say that my female spirit is much more domineering than my male spirit. So so that kind of sort of gives you an example when we talk about an individual who may identify as Two-Spirit and really grasp on the idea that we do carry two spirits within us. Next slide, please. So As part of this work also, we know that there's a lot of communities, Native communities out in, when you think about our tribal communities across the country, a lot of our communities do not, individuals who identify do not often use the word two-spirit. Because in some cultures, that meaning means different within their culture. So one of the things that I always say to people is that we need to start allowing people to identify who they are instead of putting labels on individuals. And so um, one of the things that I talk about, because we know that colonization has really impacted this community, when we talk about historical and intergenerational trauma. So what I have come across in my own research and also talking with individuals within our community and also talking with elders within the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ community, we know that that before colonization, there was a specific word in our language that individuals like within tribes would identify people like me. So one of the things I talk about is that uh, what I will often do first is I will identify as a winkta. That was the word that was given to me by my people. And then second, I will identify as a two-spirit male because that word just came about in 1990. And then lastly, I will identify as a gay male. For me, when I talk about that, that's my way of decolonizing my way of thinking and actually grasping on to the word that was given to me by my people. So this is normally a question that I like to ask people. Do you know the word in your language that would identify someone today who identifies as LGBTQ? Next slide, please. So with what I just discussed, here is an example when we talk about cultural terms to identify. So to your left, you have 4 different tribes. In the middle is the word. And lastly, on the third column, gender, that word identifies either male or female. So this gives you an example that we've had these words for thousands of years. And again, if there's anybody in the room who's attending the webinar, if you're Native, I would really like to challenge you to go back to your own community and talk with your elders and ask your elders, was there a word in our language and what was that word? Next slide, please. So when we talk about a person who identifies as two-spirit, that person is given the gift of being two-spirit means that that individual has the ability to see the world in 2 different perspectives at the same time. So for me, when I look at this slide, what I talk about is that often I can see issues or other things in both a female and male perspective. Next slide, please. So one of our anthropologists, or one of our researchers by the name of Will Roscoe, he is a non-native individual, but he went in and did a lot of research in regards to two-spirit identity. And one of the things that he discovered that the two-spirit identity is documented in 130 tribes across every region of North America and among every type of native culture. So it is very important to remember, again, what I said earlier, is that genders vary from tribe to tribe, but are similar. So again, when you're talking specifically about a certain community, it's really important for you to talk with individuals within that community to ask them, what does two-spirit mean in your culture? What does that mean in your tribe? So it's really important to ask those questions. It is even said that in some tribes have up to 15 genders to identify two-spirit individuals, or what we call gender identity. It is also important to remember that the term two-spirit is a Native American concept and should only be used by Native Americans who identify. So often we know that sometimes within the non-native communities, individuals who identify as LGBTQ will often try to take claim to that term. And my hope is that the more that we educate and bring awareness about the two-spirit identity, that we're able to call out these individuals in a respectful and good way by saying, you can't use that term. Next slide, please. And so here are some of the roles that we played as two-spirit people within our tribal communities before colonization. We were often recognized as healers or medicine people. We were parents of orphan children. We were conveyors of oral tradition and songs. We were foretellers of the future. We were name givers. We were nurses during war expedition. We were potters, matchmakers, makers of feather regalia, and we've also played special roles in Sundance. So when we talk about the Sundance, one of the things that I always like to talk about is that in South Dakota, I know of several individuals who identify as two-spirit, also play a huge role in their tribal communities with Sundance. So I know of several individuals, both male and female, who play those roles in Sundance within their community. So I like to talk about this slide because this gives everybody a understanding and realization that our two-spirit people have always been here. The two-spirit, so when we talk about these individuals, and I like to call them ancestors because that's who they are, these are the individuals who played, you know, huge roles within their community, but also the fact that we want people to know that, again, we've always been here. So the first picture we talk about Wiwa, who comes from the Zuni people. Today, we would identify her in the language that we use today that society has given us, is that she would identify as a transgender. But but she's really a male to female. She was very honored within her tribal community. She was an ambassador to the US government, and she was well respected. She was well loved by children. And then in the middle, we have Hosting Claw, who comes from the Dene. He played a huge role within his community. And then we have Pine Leaf Woman. I also love to talk about Pine Leaf Woman because she was a Crow chief. She was a woman chief. Today, we would identify her as a lesbian. Even though she was chief within her community, she didn't take on the role of representing as a male. She was a female with multiple wives, but she also played a huge role in her community by hunting with the men, going on war expeditions. And again, these individuals, you can research and learn more about them. And here's just several different pictures of individuals who identified, you know, and the reason why I love to share these pictures is just because we know that there's history. But also, when I talk about the Midwest, one of the struggles and challenges that I've had in doing research about Two-Spirit people is that in the Midwest, you will not find a lot of written stories or uh, written, like for instance, when I talk about the Winktas that come from my tribe, there is not a lot of pictures and there's not a lot of information that's written about these individuals, but what we carry is the oral traditions that are passed down from our medicine people within our communities. So again, when I've reached out and talked with individuals from my own tribe, they have basically said, you know, we don't have these pictures. We don't have this written information about the Winktas, but what we do have is just the oral stories that are passed down. Next slide, please. So before colonization, Two-Spirit people were treated with the utmost respect and honor before colonization. So this is like one of the questions that I like to ask people when I'm educating and bringing awareness. So what happened to that honor and respect? So from my understanding from my own research, and then again talking to elders who identify as Two-Spirit and getting their perspective on it. But one of the things that we know is that out of the love and respect for our Two-Spirit people, many chiefs and leaders within our tribal communities actually hid us to protect us, because what was happening was that the Europeans and the missionaries were coming in and actually murdering our Two-Spirit people. And one of the things that I also like to discuss too is that we know that same-sex marriage was passed in 2015 across the country. And when I ask people, do you believe that it was passed straight across the board, including our tribal communities? Often people believe that, but in reality, in some of our tribes, same-sex marriage is not allowed. So when you think about how many tribes that we have today, we have over 570 federally recognized tribes. From my understanding, only 30 plus tribes in the nation allow same-sex marriage. So one of the things that I talk about is that I've been with my partner for 10 years now, and it'll be 10 years, and I could marry him in Minnesota, but if I was to go back and retire and live, in my own land of the Sisseton Wahpeton, my marriage to him would not be honored because my tribe doesn't allow same-sex marriage. And so basically also too, when we, one of the things that we don't really talk about is the impact of historical and intergenerational trauma, specifically on this population. Also, one of the things that I like to talk about, well, I don't like to talk about, but it's just educating and bringing awareness to individuals, is that here is a picture of the Carlisle boarding school. So with a conversation with one of my colleagues who also identified, one of the things that we talked about was that today, so statistics say that 1 to 10 individuals may identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ. So when we look at this picture, how many of these children do you think may have identified? Because one of the things that we talk about is that before colonization, there were tribes that often would have celebrations, or they would have ceremonies when a child came out. So when we look at this picture, we know that terrible things happened within this boarding school. One of the things that we also talk about also too is that we know that our priests and our nuns and any other individuals who are a part of this school did a lot of sexual abuse, and even killed our children. Um, but what we say as individuals who perpetrate on these children often will groom their victim. Or so again, I don't like using that word victim, but also too, as speaking in the perspective of a survivor myself of many forms of violence, again, just giving that perspective that we knew that these things happened within our tribe, and that our young people were being victimized, all of our Indian children. So I like to share this picture because I often want people to think about that, because again, this is a population that's often forgotten, and an underserved population. So this is one of the only research projects that was done here in the United States in regards to the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ community. So this research was done by Dr. Karina Walters and her team. And what they did was they went into the 6 largest Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ urban communities here in the country. Minneapolis, where I'm based at right now, was one of the places that they went to. So what they did was that they gathered information in regards to the many different forms of violence that happens within our community. And this research project was called the Honors Project. You can also Google the Honors Project and read more in depth of this project. But if you notice on the column of the Two-Spirit versus the heterosexual community, you can see that the percentage of the violence that the Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people have experienced is much more higher than the heterosexual community. Now, when we talk about this, I honestly believe, and then talking with a lot of my colleagues who do this work, we also realize that this data is probably much more higher today. So I'm gonna pass it over to Jessica now.
Thank you, Lenny. So people that identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, two-spirit, questioning, people have historically faced discrimination and oppression. There's a stigmatization and rejection that still continues today, and that putting the population at an increased risk for depression, suicide, substance abuse, homelessness, being victims of bullying and other forms of violence, including sexual exploitation. And this comes from the Minnesota Human Trafficking Task Force. And as a survivor of human trafficking myself, I can confirm that this is true. I believe that myself identifying as two-spirit and bisexual is ultimately kind of what made me more prone to, want to trafficking. And the term bisexual for traffickers, it's kind of a hot word just because you can appeal to many different people. And I think that with this week being Indigenous Peoples Day as we recognize it, it's important to recognize that, Christopher Columbus and the trafficking of Indigenous people goes all the way back to those colonial contacts. And just now we're finally trying to set that aside and reclaim our space and our honor and our pride in these days, and we are honoring that as Indigenous Peoples Day and not Christopher Columbus Day. Domestic violence is also linked to sex trafficking. There, people are either abused before, during the grooming process, during the actual trafficking period, and there's many, it occurs in all segments of a community, whether it's trafficking or not, regardless of race, class, culture, ethnicity, age, physical ability, education, politics, religion, gender identity, and sexual orientation. 1 in 4 lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender people are abused by a partner during their lifetime.
All right. So with this slide, what we are going to do is define what domestic and sexual violence is within the LGBTQ two-spirit community. One of the things that I want to stress in talking about this specific slide is that often when we do talk about the LGBTQ community, we don't often engage or really know like the statistics and issues that really impacts the two-spirit community, because often we're, again, I always say we're a forgotten and underserved population. So one of the things that we know about the many, many different forms of violence is we know that it's all about power and control. In domestic and intimate partner violence, tactics in the LGBTQ relationships have the same characteristics of a heterosexual relationship, because often I believe that people still believe that that relationships between versus gay or lesbian, bisexual couples versus heterosexual couples, that they're different, and they're not. I mean, we still are human being. We still hurt just like everybody else, but yet again, often this population is dehumanized just because of our sexual orientation, our identity, and if we are in a same-sex relationship, we're often looked down upon. So we really need to sort of think about changing how we view this. And one of the things too that I just really quickly want to say is that one of the things that I talk about it, as a Native person and as a Native community is that we as people often always talk about healing within our community. One of the things that we need to remember is that all genders in our Native communities need the opportunity to heal, not just specific. And again, going back to what I said earlier, again, this population is often forgotten and an underserved population.
So I did some research on power and control and the availability of different types of power and control wheels. And this is a main one that's for power and control in lesbian, gay, transgender, and bisexual relationships. It is just kind of a wide variety of different types of abuse that can happen in these relationships, and things that kind of stem from it, like transphobia and heterosexism. And then you get into the isolation and the intimidation and things like that. And I'm just going to speak for myself, but like in a bisexual relationship versus like a straight relationship, for me, the violence that I have experienced in my lifetime has mainly come from bisexual relationships. The abuse, a lot of it has come from women. There's really only one man who abused me in my lifetime, and that was my trafficker. But other than that, it was mainly just women that I was abused by. And when you take a look at the difference of power and control wheels, this one here on the left is kind of the standard power and control wheel that is very widely shared throughout many agencies. And the reason why I don't like this specific wheel is because it gives you that false notation that only men are the abusers and women are the only ones who can get abused. Even within the language, it just says treating her like a servant and making her do sexual things against her will. The pronouns, there's no inclusivity within this. And I just find that to be very troubling because in my experience and things that I've learned and people that I know, I know a lot of men who have been abused by women. And so this one on the right, it shows it has a little bit more better language. You can see that they instead of using the word she, they use the word you. So it can be kind of geared towards anyone versus just a female. And then I did some research prior to this webinar, and I was looking around into programs and different shelters that can shelter men who have been abused by their wife or girlfriend or whoever. And there are very, very few programs that are specifically for men. I found 2 shelters that are specifically for men, and the first one wasn't even formed until 2017. So you're thinking out of hundreds and hundreds of domestic abuse shelters across the country, only 2 of those serve men. specifically. You know, a lot of them do have services for men, and they work with men who provide services in their communities, but there's very few shelters that are just specifically for men. This is a power control wheel that is geared towards teen power and control. And the reason why I show this is because, you know, all of these violent behaviors and things that we experience as adults, many of our children and many of us have experienced the same things when we were teens, but we didn't have these type of resources that are out here now for youth. And so it was important for me to show it, not only because, you know, I have a teenage daughter, I have nieces and nephews and, you know, teenage family members who have experienced violence in their lives and are starting to date and form these types of relationships. So I think to be knowledgeable and just aware that, you know, these types of behaviors can be seen in children at a very young age. You know, I have family who have been in kind of controlling and abusive type relationships when they're just teenagers. So I think as a community and as Indigenous people that we need to be looking out for one another, and we need to be looking out for these signs in our youth to, you know, make them educated and informed on these kind of red flags that people call them, because these things, they only get worse over time. From everything that I've seen, you know, if it's not addressed, if it's not educated upon at contact, then it just continues to get worse and worse. And then that's when you see, you know, teens kind of falling off the deep end or dropping out of school and things like that. So with the youth, it's highly important for us to really address this abusive behavior when they are young.
So, so in order for us to address domestic violence and sexual assault against Two-Spirit people and LGBTQ people, we must ask ourselves, am I homophobic? What is homophobia? What is transphobic? So in order for us to how and know and understand, how are we able to know if we are homo or transphobic? We need to challenge our own thoughts. What has our our community or our family taught us about individuals who identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ? If we're not willing to challenge our thoughts, then we're not going to create any change and allow or help these individuals who identify to come out and to address the issues that happens within our own community. One of the things that I know of in doing this work for quite a number of years is that a lot of the issues that we're talking about today, the domestic and sexual violence that happens within our community, a lot of our Two-Spirit people are shunned so much within their own families, within their tribal communities, that often we don't feel safe enough to talk about the issues that impacts us, the violence that we experience because of just the fear of how we're going to be treated. Again, what Jessica has said so far about herself, I too am also a survivor of many forms of violence and also a survivor of domestic violence. When I was experiencing domestic violence and being so far away from home, it was hard for me to leave this relationship, but also the fact that I carried so much shame. So when I returned home after I chose to leave this relationship, I didn't talk about what I experienced. So I carried a lot of trauma with me. And many years later is when I finally decided I needed to go on my healing journey. And then having conversations with a lot of my friends and colleagues, again, us not feeling safe enough to talk about these issues that really impacts our community. So we really need to change how we view this. We need to create a safe space for our people to heal. Um, and we just, and often one of the things that I always say too, because when I talk about the transgender community, one of the things that I've learned from one of my really good friends who I call my relative, but also someone who has taught me about the transgender identity. But one of the things that she told me was that, you know, when we do this work, we should often bring in a transgender person to be able to talk about this, because specifically for me, I do not identify as transgender. I can present you with all the statistics, all the issues that impacts this community, but I cannot give you lived experience. And so going back to what I said earlier is that we need to invite survivors, and the survivors should be the experts. Often we have individuals who have never experienced forms of violence are the ones who are actually saying what our community needs, and that's not helpful. Um, so are we willing to challenge other people's thoughts? So one of the issues that I see really happening, which I've been working really hard in regards to child welfare, is that often one of the things that I say is that we as Indian people need a specific curriculum to train our native foster parents of youth who identify. One of the things that I discuss is that, our people mean well, right? I mean, we understand that whole concept of helping our own community, helping our families, taking in, children that aren't ours and loving them um, just like how we would love our own children. But the reality of it is that if you put a child in a home where the homophobic slurs like gay, faggot, dyke are being used within that home, that child is not going to come out, and that child's not going to feel safe. And again, often we say, through a lot of research, statistics, truth, that often perpetrators will often know who their victims are. And so they begin to groom these children and hurt these children. And when these children do not feel safe, they will run to the streets and become a bigger target for victimization. And when I talk about a bigger target of victimization, I'm talking about sex and human trafficking. And again, that I know what I also know of is that topic is not much really talked about within our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ community, because again, we need to continue to educate even within our own community about what that means. Um, are we willing to help? And if we don't know how, will we seek out answers? So when I talk about that, I usually refer to organizations, coalitions who are willing to bring in individuals who present on these issues. Specifically, today, both Jessica and I, through our own lived experience, but also educating ourselves and talking with people within our community about all these issues. And are we going to keep silent? If we keep silent about all these issues, we are not going to create change and healing within this community. So here are some barriers to resistance. Um, Legal definitions of domestic violence that does not include same-sex couples, dangers of outing oneself when seeking assistance. So one of the things that when we talk about outing and just really understanding what outing means, I will give you an example. And we do this within even our own community, our own Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ community, but I just wanted to give an example of what that means. So I had met an individual who I just love and adore, who has done amazing work with outside of the transgender community, who identifies as a transgender woman, Native specific. Um, and one of the things that happened was that I was so excited about meeting her and all this amazing work that she's done nationally and then within her own state. But one of the things that had happened was we were at a conference and I just like began to talk about this person, said her name, and everything, and found out later in a conversation with her, she said, "Lenny, do you realize you outed me?" And I'm like, "What?" And she said, "You outed me because I didn't give you permission to talk about me in that way, and even saying my name." She said, and so because of that, what I could have created on her was violence, because individuals who seek out this kind of violence will often hurt people who they know. And so for me, that was a really, really eye opener, because I didn't realize that I even outed her. So there's so many different ways when we talk about outing people. And so I would really encourage you to understand and know what that means, because, you know, we can be making assumptions on people and not even realize that we're making assumptions. And like one of the things that I also talked about too is that you may have a male who may be feminine, and right away we put that label on that person that he's gay, he may be bisexual, he may be two-spirit or whatever. In reality, what we're doing is we're making an assumption that he identifies like that, but he may identify as a heterosexual male. So that's really something to think about, because again, not all men um, who are feminine are two-spirit or gay or bisexual. Um, and same thing with heterosexual. So again, what I'm saying is that we're putting a target on this person, when really what we should be doing is going to and asking these individuals, how do you identify? Um, there is a lack of survivors knowing specific assistance or resources. Again, Jessica talked a little bit about that. Potential homophobia, transphobia, biphobia with staff and providers of domestic violence and sexual assault organizations. Low levels of confidence in the sensitivity of effectiveness of law enforcement officials and court for LGBTQ people. So we know that this is a huge issue within our tribal communities, that we don't have a lot of laws to protect individuals who identify against domestic violence or sexual assault. I do want to just do a shout out to two amazing females who identify, who have done amazing work in South Dakota in passing a law within their own tribal community, as well as reaching out to the other tribal communities in South Dakota. So I really want to do a shout out to Muffy and her wife Philippe for the amazing work that they have done so far within South Dakota. Next slide, please. So here are some more barriers to resistance. The lack of education and awareness of our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people in our tribal communities. We will often hear people say, well, we don't have those kind of people within our community, which we know is wrong, and that is very like a very hateful statement to make, because again, what I had said earlier is that we're dehumanizing this population. We know that there's lack of specific research and study of Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people who experience domestic violence and sexual assault. What I know of is that a lot of the research and a lot of the statistics that we see in regards to the LGBTQ community is specifically that community. And the reason why I say that is because the proper questions are never asked in regards to how a person identifies. So again, even though there have been maybe an individual who identified as two-spirit, they're so intertwined with that mainstream language that we don't know the proper data. We don't have like the proper research. We don't have the data that really specifies how this is a huge issue within our community. Again, going back to what I said earlier, there's no tribal codes to protect within our communities. And then just the lack of understanding the impact of historical and intergenerational trauma on our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ community. So with that, I will turn it over to Michaela.
Hello, thanks so much for such a great presentation. I always learn so much from both of you, so I'm just really grateful we have you today. There was one question that was brought up in the Facebook comments, and I will say for those of you who are tuning in, this is going to be a question and answer section of this presentation. So please post your comments, your questions in the comments, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So there's one question here from Terry Strong, and she said, is there a certain way these issues should be brought up concerning trafficking and becoming a victim in that way?
Yeah, I can answer that. I think it kind of depends on where you're being brought up with who. There's, ways to bring these things up, but you kind of almost have to tailor it to who you're speaking with. Because if you're speaking with, let's say, a survivor versus somebody who hasn't experienced trafficking, there's there's different ways that you would have to address it for sure. I know, like, myself being a survivor of trafficking, I'm really open with talking about it, and some survivors aren't. Some people who go through these things are still very hidden about it, and that's completely fine. But for me, being able to openly talk about it and educate people on the risk factors of it, that has in itself brought me healing and growth. And just to know, like, hey, I could maybe save somebody's life by just speaking about my own experiences and the things that I went through and the things that led me to being trafficked. So yeah, that's a really broad question. It could go, either way, depending on who you're speaking with or what your platform is.
Absolutely.
Can I just kind of tailor off of what Jessica said? One of the things that so most recently, I attended a webinar. It was in the early winter, probably January or February, around that time. And I was really astonished in the fact that this presentation, one of the organizations that was a part of it was the Missing and Exploited Children organization, national. And in their presentation, they had stated that 51% of gay boys are being trafficked in the country. And I was just totally blown away with that because, again, we don't see those statistics of our male population. So when we talk about sex and human trafficking, one of the things that I really express is that we get an understanding that all genders are being impacted by sex and human trafficking. And I've had the experience to, I shouldn't say experience, but the honor to have sat with individuals who I know were trafficked, but they never came to that realization themselves. And again, we should never push, our beliefs on somebody to say, well, you were trafficked, right? Because they need to come to that space. So, and as painful as it is, I mean, we do have Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people who are experiencing trafficking. We have Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people who are experiencing domestic violence, sexual assault. We have males who are victims of females, and again, until we can start breaking down these barriers and helping our people within our communities heal, we aren't going to bring change.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. So our next question is from Marlon, and he says, do you have a list of any recommended Indigenous scholars who have written about the large and complex issue of Indigenous gender and sexuality?
Oh, gosh. Let me think. Well, I mean, I do love to read myself, so I have a lot of a lot of things that I like to read. But one of the things that I also like to do is I like to reach out to the elders within our community and talk with them. because again, I look at them as being the teachers, because I didn't learn any of this about identity and all of this without, you know, asking questions, being able to go and talk to elders within the community, because again, I always say that our elders carry knowledge. Um, and we know that our elders are not going to be around. But I do have like several like resources of books that I have read and and often even shared with other people. But again, I like to talk with elders and I like to talk with people within our community and just have conversation about our genders identities and like our beliefs within our tribal communities, because you know, when we talk about two-spirit people, each tribe has a different perspective in how they view individuals like me and like the roles that we played in communities. So again, we need to understand that the term two-spirit is a universal term that's used across the country. And again, making sure that we know and understand that in some tribal communities, again, it may mean something different versus me that lives in or me from South Dakota. Um, you know, so it's a lot to think about.
Mm. Thank you. And I really think a large part of this issue is that there isn't a whole lot of academic, research and data. So that's one of the aims of these webinars, is to really get folks interested in asking these questions so that we can have scholars and data to point to in the future. So the next question comes from Jackie B, and she asks, what is the meaning of people introducing themselves as she, hers, or his, them, for example? Is it a safety issue? Or can you let us know why we should introduce ourselves like this?
Well, I think you know, that's a really good question, and we all have our different thoughts about that, right? So for me, specifically, and I will talk about me, even though I have a lot of respect for people who want to use pronouns. We call that pronouns. So one of the things that I tell people when people ask me to introduce myself and which pronouns do I use, my response to that is usually I am, you know, Lenny, and I prefer not to use pronouns because I believe that's a form of colonization. And the reason why I say that is because we know why pronouns was created. Um, you know, it was specifically to help the transgender community, right? So that we are respectful to them. You know, there's just so many different thoughts on that. But so I'm not taking that away from people. Um, I respect people who want to use pronouns, but what I don't like about it is that often what happens is people will say your name and what pronouns do you use, when we should be asking brown people, our native people, indigenous people, we should be asking them, do you prefer to use pronouns and which ones? Because there's so many different ideas that come from that, because like even within Minnesota, in the individuals that I've talked to, elders within the community, a lot of them are very confused about that whole concept, because you know, when we think about before colonization, our Indian people within our communities respected everyone. That wasn't like an important concept of our people. We respected our people. We loved them no matter who they were. So again, you have to sort of think about how colonization has really changed our way of thinking and how we view this population. So again, for me, I don't use pronouns. I always say, call me Lenny. You know, call me a human being because that's who I am. Call me whatever you want, but don't call me late for a buffet, you know. But again, you know, I really want people to understand that. And again, I respect people who want to use pronouns. They should be allowed to do that. But for me, what I don't like is how I'm addressed about it, and that needs to change.
Mm.
And what I like about when I talk with my Native colleagues who work here in the state of Minnesota, a lot of them feel like they're being forced to respond to that, but they don't know how to respond to that. So again, I have like colleagues who are identifying themselves in a non-native space in their Indian name, which cuts the whole conversation, which I think is amazing that they can do that. So Jessica, your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I kind of agree with everything that you said, Lenny. I typically do not introduce any pronouns when I'm introducing myself, but like if somebody really wanted to know that, I definitely would tell them. I just go by she, her. I do identify as a two-spirit woman, so the typical she, her is what I would use. But yeah, like it's not something that I work into my introduction. I never have and probably never will. Um, and that just goes back to what Lenny was saying too about that being kind of a colonization tool. And yeah, like it's just not something that I do.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for your perspectives. I think a lot of times we talk about decolonization as a really abstract idea. So it's really great to have some kind of concrete examples of colonization and how we can decolonize some of our language. So we are out of questions at the moment. I encourage folks to send them in as we have a few more minutes. But I did have a question. So one of the topics that you brought up is that it's often a barrier for Two-Spirit and LGBTQ folks to seek services because in a way that's them coming out, and they might not be ready for that. So could you speak to, from a service provider or researcher lens, of how we can reduce some of those barriers to ensure that these folks who really need the support the most are able to access it?
Okay, so from my experience in doing a lot of trainings across the country and doing trainings within coalitions and domestic violence organizations, so I don't usually tell people that I do this until later when I sit down and have a conversation with them about like, what is it that you specifically want me to help you with, right? So what I will often do is I will go into an organization and I will look around. And if there is no like sort of indication that they provide services to me who identifies, like specifically, we talk about like a small rainbow flag sticker, or if we talk about a safe zone sticker, if I don't see those things, then I assume that this organization is not going to help me as a gay, or as a two-spirit or gay male who is seeking services for domestic violence. Um, One of the things that I really encourage organizations is to sort of think about like, what are you doing to create a safe space for this population? Do you have like literature sitting out in regards to LGBTQ people? Do you maybe have a poster or something that recognizes same-sex couples? If you don't have any of that information, I guarantee that you will not have an individual who identifies that will come to your organization. And more importantly, I think it's very important to train your staff in regards to all of the issues that impacts this community, but also to check your own biases. Because if you do not check your own biases, what's going to happen is that you are not going to give the proper services to these individuals who identify.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jessica, would you like to answer?
Yeah. I just wanted to add to that too, like what I was talking about earlier with the kind of little bit of research that I did about services that are available for men. And I think as like a service provider, especially for somebody who's doing like domestic abuse classes and things like that, um, there's such a stigma, that stigma that we need to work around to break down, that men are the abusers and women are the only ones who get abused. And these domestic abuse classes are, geared towards that. they are really pushing that abuser role on men when they even that come throughout the courts, you know, have to go to these mandatory classes when in reality, like they were the ones being abused. And so I think as service providers and people, you know, that work with victims of domestic abuse and even people who, you know, have been or are abusers, you really have to what Lenny was saying, you know, check your bias and, you know, kind of, you gotta be really able to kind of switch your lens on these issues because you never know what situation it's going to be, you know, if this man's going to be an abuser or if he was being abused, vice versa if you have a female. So I think you have to be really fluid with that within those classes and to form those types of classes to be more inclusive of men, women, and two-spirit native LGBTQ people, because otherwise, you know, they're not going to come. Like Lenny said, I'm not going to come if there's not a sticker on the door. So you got to really make people feel welcome in a space so that they are able to heal, because without that comforting space to heal, then it's just a ripple effect and things just continue to barrel out and get worse. And then, yeah.
Yeah, you know, and one of the things too, because we know that a lot of our females are advocates when it comes to domestic violence and sexual assault. So I just quickly want to share a story of a Native woman who reached out to me who's an advocate. And one of the things, and one of the reasons why she reached out to me was because she was going to be working with a male survivor who was raped by another male. And so her first question to me was, how do I work with him? My response to her was, well, you would work with him the same way that you would work with a female. You would show compassion, empathy to this individual. So anyway, throughout our whole conversation, and by the time we got to the end of our conversation, she realized that she had her own biases against male victims who were victimized and, you know, sexually or in domestic violence relationships. So for her, it was a learning experience that I need to change the way that I think, that, you know, that I always believed that it was just females that were, you know, the survivors. So I think that's a great teaching. And I think that we need to do a better job of addressing that in our advocacy work, because we need to, and like I said earlier, we need to remember that violence happens with all genders. So.
Mhm. Great. Well, we are at the end of our time here. So I just really want to uplift and thank you two for sharing so much of your knowledge with us here today. I encourage folks, like I mentioned earlier, this is part of a series. So all of October, we are going to be doing different webinars. So our next one is going to be next Friday at 2 o'clock. We are going to have Mary Catherine Nagel and Sarah Deer on to discuss Savannah's Act and kind of the advocacy it took to get it passed, and then what's next. And then we'll be coming back the following week on Tuesday with a discussion about men and boys facing sexual violence and domestic violence. So we really hope to see you again, and thanks so much for joining.